confusion with the chat box. Full disclosure, we're usually doing live events in the past on Microsoft Teams Live. This is our first time using the Zoom webinar as a live feature, so just bear with us as we get through some of these hiccups. But nonetheless, we are excited to be here today and that you're with us. This is the kind of rebirth of a series we did last spring called Meet the Experts. We're bringing it back this year. Kicking it off today for the first installment of a monthly presentation from now until May. And we're excited to have speaker Taylor Morton with us. Before we move on, a little bit about the office and about me. My name is Thad Copeland. I am the Deputy Director of Sustainability and joined today by several of my colleagues behind the scenes that I'd also want to introduce. Pat Keys, who you just heard from, and Eliza Brenman on our team, and also our Director of Sustainability, Meredith McDermott. So we're back here trying to bring this to you. And the next thing I wanted to show is a couple of norms. As a heads up, we are going to record this today for our folks that aren't able to make it. Will be posted on our YouTube channel sometime next week. It'll also be sent as a follow-up to everyone that attended today. And then at the end, we are going to have a Q&A with Taylor. So please put your questions in the Q&A box and we will be able to see them and respond to them the best we can. Some of them we can respond to in real time, and others we'll save for Taylor at the end. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Meredith, who will be introducing our speaker.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Thad. It's great to be here. Like Thad mentioned, our first Meet the Experts, we started this series last spring and we wanted to continue it. And what we're trying to do this spring is have every month have a different kind of focus or theme. And February, because we all feel like February needs a little spice and some really positive, discussions, just because the weather is usually so bad. This month is environmental justice. Taylor, our special guest, works very, very hard on this topic, and no one can communicate all of the things that are going on or that need to go on better than Taylor. So just want to welcome Taylor Morton. Taylor is from WEACT for Environmental Justice. They've been with WEACT since 2016. For those of you who do not know what WEACT for Environmental Justice is, it is a community organization that's based in Harlem, and it works to build healthy communities by ensuring that people of color and or low-income residents, that they're able to participate in the creation of sound, equitable, and fair policies that include environmental health and protection and practices for all. So Taylor Morton is now the Director of Environmental Health and Education after a recent promotion and very well-deserved one. So congratulations on that, Taylor. Taylor leads the Environmental Health and Justice Leadership Training, also a variety of climate education policy initiatives for WEACT. Taylor also leads the NYCHA Healthy Homes program. One thing that we're kind of a part of a variety of different things together, different task forces, coalitions, and one that I think is really, really cool that Taylor leads on behalf of WEACT is the Climate Justice Education Task Force, something that hopefully Taylor will tell you a little bit more about, but there's a lot of growing momentum for not only environmental justice, but specifically climate justice and making sure that policies and educational standards really do address these very important things. So without further ado, I want to introduce our partner and friend, Taylor Morton. And Taylor, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. We love to partner with the Office of Sustainability and look forward to it, any opportunity that we can get. So I'm going to just take a moment and share my screen and we'll get started. There we go. All right, I apologize for any background noise. It is New York City. Never stops. So nice to meet you all. My name is Taylor Morton. I'm the Director of Environmental Health and Education at WEACT for Environmental Justice. I've been in the WEACT world for a while. First as an intern and have been able to work my way up as a director. I did teach middle school science for a couple of years, and education has really been my passion. I actually I went on a podcast recently, and they were like, "How does it feel to be an activist?" And I was like, "Oh, I'm an educator. Just want to be clear. Educators do both organizing and advocating every day, right? But that's like the title I very much lean towards. But I wanted to start off with a couple of key terms and definitions, and then talk about the relationship between environmental health and environmental justice. So a little bit more about my department at WEACT and what we do specifically. And then talk a little bit more about some focus areas. And if you're someone who's just getting into environmental justice, or if you're a teacher or a parent who's wanting to know a little bit more of how you can engage in different ways to learn more about environmental justice, we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about how to transform our communities. How can we act and actually transform things? To talk a little bit more about WEACT and who we are, I think Meredith gave a really great overview of who we are and what we do. But we've been around for about 30 years, give or take, and a big part of our mission and what we do is to make sure that that communities, lower-income communities, communities of color are able to participate when we think about environmental policies and practices. We really take on a couple of different approaches. So I work in environmental health, and we take sort of a research approach and transforming research and disseminating research into general education or policy. We have a policy department that works at the local, state, and federal levels. We have a federal office in Washington, D.C. We have a D.C. office, and they work on federal policy. And we also do community organizing. So making sure that we can especially engage our residents in Northern Manhattan and in New York City as well, and really advocate at the state level when needed. So we'll talk a little bit more about WEACT membership at the end if you'd like to get more involved and hear a little bit more about what we do. So something I wanted to start off with, I love starting off with key terms because I think it gets us all on a clear basis of what we are talking about. And key terms really matter when we're thinking about policy, when we're thinking about grants and the ways that we determine which communities are impacted and by what issues. So my first definition that I want to use is on environmental racism. So what is environmental racism? So we're really thinking about the discrimination that plays out that's race-based when we think about environmental policies and practices. And you can have environmental injustice, right, that is not race-based, but a lot of what we see, especially in the United States, is this environmental racism. And the way that I like to frame environmental racism and environmental justice is that environmental racism is the cause, right? It's the making explicit decisions on where people should live and what resources they should have and all of these other pieces. And the environmental justice pieces are the solutions that we're looking for, right? We're thinking about how we create that equity and call for that inclusion and demand that, right? And that the two play a really interesting relationship. When we think about environmental racism, we'll talk a little bit more about what it means to say my neighborhood is killing me, right? When we think about environmental racism, we're really wanting to dig into some of that historical context. So in the times that I've been able to teach or speak about environmental racism, history plays a really big role in understanding how we got here, understanding how cities are made, and even in our own history, right? Pulling out the bias, pulling out histories that are uplifted in search of histories and stories that have been covered up for a lot of different reasons. So environmental racism is key, and we're going to use the our definition of environmental justice. So we're thinking about fair treatment and meaningful involvement, which are the two key tenets of environmental justice. We have our executive director here, Peggy Shepard, and she is our executive director and one of our co-founders. And behind the story of WEACT, she and some colleagues decided to block the West Side Highway in protest of a sewage treatment plant in the Harlem community that was impacting folks as far as having respiratory issues and bad smells and all these other things that were impacting residents. But she was able to use the settlement money from that case to get a jump start on WEACT, and I think is a really great example of what it means to act around environmental injustices, right? What it means to demand the fair treatment and meaningful involvement. And those two pieces are very different and very important. Through our work around policy, we really try to push for and advocate for that meaningful involvement and absolutely the fair treatment, but understanding those two are related. A lot of times, policy is created, they'll say, well, we thought this was fair treatment, right? But without that meaningful involvement of communities who will be impacted, right? That it's really easy to miss that fair treatment piece, right? And to really not understand what that means. But there are a lot of groups who've been working around environmental justice, and what you'll find if you are wanting to work with or partner with groups who work on environmental justice issues, and we'll talk about this in a moment, is that sometimes they don't have environmental justice in their title. A lot of groups may focus on specific communities. Maybe that's a group that works with Latinx communities specifically, or works with Asian communities specifically, or anything like that. Sometimes there are a lot of different angles that people take to engage in this work. And speaking a little bit more about environmental justice, we have here a picture of Dr. King, who was in Memphis, Tennessee for the sanitation worker strike, right? And that was where he was ultimately assassinated. But really understanding that the environmental justice movement has a lot of roots in a lot of different movements, especially civil rights, thinking about the different indigenous movements that have come way before the civil rights era. And specifically, when we think about civil rights, placing that in the context of the Southern US. We have a picture here that's of Warren County, North Carolina. And Warren County is basically one of the greatest starts of the environmental justice movement, and understanding in the South that a lot of things that folks were fighting against were landfills in their communities, what it means to live next to a landfill. There are a lot of cases as well here in Whispering Pines. It's a case in Texas, and there are a few other cases, and even more recent cases, right, where we've seen folks sue the city or the county or any private entities that have an involvement in a landfill. There's a really interesting case as well in Dixon, Tennessee, with NRDC, the Natural Resources Defense Council, where folks are taking this to task and saying, listen, you can't just put a landfill near our community, right? It's going to impact our health, and understanding that the decision to do so, right, is intentional, as something that folks have chosen to do because they don't want environmental hazards in their communities, or they want to be closer to resources. The environmental justice movement also has a lot of roots in farmers' rights, workers' rights, and almost you name it. The environmental justice movement has folks who are either tangentially or directly related in this work. To talk a little bit more about environmental justice events, you probably have heard of most, if not all, of these events, but, and I say events understanding that we sort of get snapshots in time sometime of how communities have been impacted, understanding that there's there are long histories behind the ways that communities have been disenfranchised around environment. So here's one of our old flyers, our old campaign flyer says, if you live uptown, breathe at your own risk. And that was really around diesel bus fumes can kill. And that was really around our knowledge and understanding that the majority of bus depots in Manhattan are located above 96th Street, and what that means for folks who travel uptown, what it means for kids who live uptown and have to live in poor air quality. Some of these you'll be familiar with, but thinking about issues around lead in Flint, Michigan, and Newark, New Jersey as well. Newark, New Jersey also has a really interesting history around environmental justice. If you're looking for a community that has its own rich and interesting history around environmental injustices and folks who have been mobilizing and engaging. But thinking about Standing Rock and looking at Cancer Alley as well in Louisiana, there are a lot of different environmental justice events that we can sort of point to. And it's interesting to take a look back down the road and see how those issues came to be and who are the communities who have been impacted. So what is climate justice? As WEACT, we work on both environmental justice and climate justice issues. But really understanding that as our climate changes, there are folks who are going to be impacted first and worst. And that's going to relate to compromised health, financial burdens, social and cultural disruptions. I think we're seeing a lot of this currently when we think about communities in Texas who have been impacted by a changing climate and have been left without the resources. And I think really hinges on this idea that resiliency is a right, that regardless of who you are, right, you don't deserve to be left without resources to survive. And that there, I think a serious acknowledgement that there are sacrifice zones. There are places that have been intentionally left without resources or left to the most extreme of climate changes and communities who aren't ready for those changes by no doing of their own. And so climate justice, if we're thinking of that really solution-oriented piece of it, right, seeks to protect the rights of folks who are going to be impacted by those climate changes first and worst. And so what we may see as far as climate justice solutions may be around general resiliency. How do we make communities who have been impacted historically by environmental injustices, who have been impacted by economic injustices, racial injustices, all of these other things, how do we make sure that they are protected? Because we know that as the climate changes, the burden will be put onto them, and they will bear the impact of these changes by not having the resiliency and all these other things. So that's also something to keep in mind. There are a lot of communities who have been historically impacted by environmental justice events who will be held vulnerable to those climate justice events and changes and climate injustices. And that a lot of time there's a synergy between the two, between environmental injustices and climate injustices. And health is where we pay the toll. Feel free to pop in questions in the Q&A section as well. And I can definitely get to them at the end if you see something that comes up. So on that topic of environmental health and environmental justice, I work in the environmental health department. We also focus on education in a lot of ways the two go hand in hand. And a really interesting sort of framing into this work is thinking about social determinants of health. So what are the things in our environment, in our sphere of living that are economic or social conditions that influence our health status? So this is not an inclusive list when we think about social determinants of health, but just sort of an example. But thinking about our neighborhood and environment, economic stability, access to education and the quality of that education, whether or not your school has resources and is teaching about certain topics, and social and community context, right? When we look at these social determinants of health, we get a clear picture of why our health is the way it is. I think it's also very interesting when we think about solutions, right? If one of our social determinants of health is neighborhood and environment, maybe we're thinking about walkability. We want to make, walkability more accessible for folks as an alternative to using public transportation, right? And maybe the solution for walkability or the pathway that we go down, no pun intended, is really great for folks who identify as BIPOC, right? But maybe isn't great for folks who identify as queer, right? Thinking about the context that certain groups will engage in some of these topics is really important when we think about solutions and trying to improve health overall. But there's a really great tool called the New York City Environmental Health Data Portal. If you haven't used it or haven't perused on it, I highly recommend it. But it does a really great job of highlighting this idea that we can tell our life expectancy by our zip code. And that really highlights this injustice. If all of these things, your access to education, your access to healthy food, the cost of healthy food, whether or not that food is culturally inclusive to you and your family, and all of the things that we just mentioned, the neighborhood context and economics, all those sort of things, right? When we add and calculate all of those things together, we get a life expectancy of a place. And understanding that there are these inequities. I think New York City is a really great and interesting case study for looking at a lot of these differences, right? We get a different life expectancy for different communities. And what we will, if you ever get a chance to go on and look at the Environmental Health and Data Portal, what you'll sort of see is that a lot of the communities tend to have similar issues when we look at different problems. So a lot of the communities who have been impacted by lead, so we're thinking about areas of Northern Manhattan, especially in large parts of the Bronx, but especially in the South Bronx, parts of Brooklyn and Queens, and even this area in Staten Island have been impacted by a lot of different issues disproportionately. And we see that with differences in life expectancy, and that health is sort of the toll that we pay when we think about the impact of environmental injustices. A really great tool that I would recommend is the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and I can come back and put these links here or send them via email. But the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation put together a tool where you can put in your zip code, and they will tell you what your life expectancy is based off of these social determinants of health. So I just used looking at New York City. It will tell you on the local, state, and federal level. Looking at New York versus Georgia, right? There are differences in life expectancy, and they tell you in the calculator sort of what they use to calculate. And there are some calculators that are similar to these, and they use sort of different factors to understand that. But it can be a really jarring thing to see that your life expectancy, if you live in one area, can be different to another based off of environmental injustices and access to resources and things that you might need to live your fullest life. And I think that's going to lead us to talking about focus areas. If you are a parent, if you are a teacher, if you're a student, whoever you are, right? A lot of times when we're thinking about environmental justice, we're we're saying environmental justice and sort of talking about it in a broad light, but there are so many different areas that you could talk about within EJ's sort of scope. There's so many different ways that that our environment has been, environment in our communities have been impacted by environmental injustices. And this is just sort of a broad look at the work that we do at WEACT. We don't, there are times where we're focusing on, maybe 8 of these at a time. And there are times where we're focusing on more or less of these topics. But this is sort of a sample of the areas that we've worked on historically. And we'll talk about a few in depth, but if you're wanting to know more, I think a good practice of knowing a little bit more about environmental justice in your own local area or as a topic is to take on one of these topics, learn a little bit more about environmental justice in these contexts, thinking about clean air and climate justice and some of these other topics. There's a lot to go on. And there are certain communities that have sort of a broader sort of understanding of these topics. For example, I used to live in Atlanta, Georgia when I was in college, and water quality was a really big topic, right? It's the topic of the time when we think about combined sewage overflow and some of those other things. But when I moved to New York, right, at the time, clean air quality was a really big topic. And not to say that it wasn't a big deal in Atlanta and that, there aren't these issues in New York, right? But a lot of times what we'll see is that some areas have a more specific focus and a scope around some of these topics. And at the same time, rarely do you ever find EJ communities who are dealing with just one issue. Maybe you'll find that, for example, in New York City, right, all of these issues are prevalent, right? But at times that there may be a heavier focus on some of these topics. So I just wanted to dive into, if you're wanting to learn a little bit more about these focus areas, ways that you could learn more, or places that you could start, and then talk a little bit about some of our gains in some of these areas as well. So clean air quality. What can cause poor air quality? Where do you start? Thinking about proximity to highways, proximity to marine transfer stations and bus depots and other facilities can be a really great start for this work. We work with a school in Washington Heights called the Wheel School, which is a school that's really focusing on ways to improve air quality in their community through student-led project. But I think even having a good understanding that their proximity as a school to the highway will and can impact their health is a really important part of the learning process for students in their science departments, which has been really good for us as well, because we've been able to work with students and try to develop them as leaders. But this is a really great place to start if you're wanting to know more about clean air. There are parts of New York City that deal with clean air more because of their proximity to highways and marine transfer stations, especially in the Bronx, parts of Northern Manhattan, and parts of Brooklyn and Queens as well, and some specific areas in Staten Island. But a lot of schools have air monitors on top of their school now that you can sort of see what the air quality is going to be like from day to day. And there have been some really interesting federal and state programs in the past that have sort of highlighted what air quality will be like from day to day. One of our really big projects on clean air, if you've ever been to the Mother Clara Hale bus depot in Northern Manhattan, that is a green bus depot and is one of the first in the country, but we had a really big hand in it and organizing with community members to make sure that they felt heard, understanding that they were going to be the people who were going to be living next to the bus depot. But we also have campaigned with the MTA to make sure that the fuel that buses are using have been switched and retrofitted to being either a hybrid, and pushing and advocating for electric buses in the city, understanding that if the bus depots are going to be located uptown, that folks who live in communities of color, folks who live in lower income communities are going to be impacted more heavily by these issues. What does climate justice cover? So thinking about climate justice, we have a lot of really great initiatives around climate justice currently. We've been doing a lot of really great work around extreme heat and urban heat island effect. My colleague and our policy director, Sonal Jessel, has been working really hard on this and making sure that that residents uptown will be thinking about COVID, understanding that folks are going to be in their homes more often, right? Have access to air conditioning or some sort of cooling agent, and that's been really important work. We also do work around energy efficiency and decarbonization, community resiliency, and just transition. A really great project that I've worked on with students before, I've worked on with folks before, is around community resiliency. See if your city or if your state has a community resiliency plan. We worked on one with Northern Manhattan residents. It's called the Northern Manhattan Climate Action Plan. If you get a chance, look it up. The brochure for it is humongous. It will take up like a table. The PDF for it is also very large. So just a heads up. But I think it offers a really great insight into what those partnerships look like. And if you live in a community or a place that doesn't have a clear climate action plan, right? How do you work with community members to organize around that? How do we create that? And then just transition, understanding that as we are calling and advocating for our energy sources to change, that as those changes happen, people will have to be trained in different skills that will translate to those jobs. So if you are working in a job that really hinges around fossil fuels, how do we make sure that you have training around that, around new technologies that are better for the environment, to make sure that we're making sure that folks still have jobs. And so we have a really great solar training program that we've been working on residents with, that has been really great. And we have a worker training program for adults otherwise, and who are wanting to get into environmental jobs. But that's been a really great way to connect with community and understand that the communities who have been impacted first and worst are often folks who do have jobs in different environmental fields that may or may not have a benefit for our environment. So we want to make sure that as everything else transitions, as our energy sources transition, as the way that we do things, as we improve, that we're offering skills to folks who need that and those experiences. Healthy homes. So this is part of the work that I work specifically in. What makes a healthy home? Maybe folks, you can use the chat, right? The chat is doable. Yeah. I would love if folks could type in the chat, what's a healthy home to you? So I'll give folks a minute. What is a healthy home? Great. So we have some answers here. I think they're really great. It's warm, safe, and dry, a comfortable temperature, supports physical and mental health. It's sealed from the elements. That's a really good one. Absolutely. So all of these are right. You can definitely add those, add more in the chat as well if you would like. But all of those answers are right, right? There are so many facets of what it means to have a healthy home. And part of that is understanding and thinking about infrastructure. So is my home the right temperature when the seasons change, or if there's a really extreme season change, right? Is it safe and dry, right? Safety is a really big piece of that. But what we often find is there are a lot of issues around lead, mold, waste, pest and pesticides, and indoor air quality. And also really interesting too, because there are a lot of things like mold, right? Where you can see mold is growing. You can see it growing behind your fridge or behind your stove or whatever, right? But when we think about things like lead, where there's no safe level of lead in your body, right, and has a really insidious impact on children explicitly, that's not something that you can see, right? And that's not something that you can necessarily change on your own, but that takes a professional to come in. As if you have lead paint, right, they need to make sure that it's removed in a certain fashion, right? Those aren't things that we can see, and it takes a lot of work to make sure that landlords are being held accountable, that if you live in public housing, that NYCHA is being held accountable, and that everything has been fixed and adjusted. But I think Healthy Homes has been really interesting when we think about COVID as well, because we spend most of our time in our home. And what does it mean to spend most of your time in your home? And what does it mean to spend most of your time in your home and your home is killing you, right? Your home is having an impact on your health. And what we've seen is that there are communities who have pre-existing health conditions, often due to those environmental injustices or other injustices that are related to environmental injustice, and that they are the ones who are most heavily impacted when we think about COVID and a lot of those changes as well. So Healthy Homes is a big part of our work that we do at WEACT. Definitely something to think about. If you want to know more about Healthy Homes, I highly recommend you dig into one or all of these issues as a good starter: lead, mold, waste, pest, pesticides, indoor air quality. And we did a lot of lobbying around mold and lead specifically to pass a couple of local laws. And that's been really great. But a really big part of this work around Healthy Homes as well is to make sure that folks are being held accountable, and that the implementation of laws is happening. And you know, that's something to think about. Healthy Homes is also really interesting too, because depending on the type of home you may have different issues. So we don't often work with folks who have a lot of radon in their homes, but you know, you may live in an area where that's a bigger issue. So digging into that local context may also be useful. And the last one I'm going to go over is toxic-free products. So what's a toxic product? Toxic product contains substances like chemicals, which can be harmful to our health, often depending on the dose. Oftentimes we see toxic-free or toxic products in children's toys. We can get them in hair products, food packaging. If you know about PFAS, that's another really interesting one. Beauty products, makeup products, anything that we put into our body or on our skin, right, can have a toxic chemical in it, right? Especially when we think about manufacturing, packaging, all those other sort of things. So we've worked around toxic products in children's toys and feminine products and you know, food packaging as well. We're doing a lot of work around currently toxic products in hair care products and beauty care products for women of color. understanding that there are toxic chemicals disproportionately in those products that serve women of color specifically. But again, if you're wanting to know more about that, I would definitely dig into one of those areas. So either with children, in certain beauty products and food packaging, those are really great places to start. And there's a lot of interesting legislation moving around, especially at the state and the federal level. But it's really interesting to get into. If you want to know more about that, feel free to email me as well. And I want to talk about how we transform our communities to be better. So thinking about levels of activism, we work at the local and national level, national also meaning federal and state policy. We do a lot of lobbying when we can. We have a lot of work going around now on voter engagement. And at the local level, we get involved in almost everything. So community board meetings, we do a lot of work with schools. So we are a membership-based organization. So if that's a way that you want to engage with us, that really works out. I'm going to do a shameless plug for our education policy work that we've been working on. Really understanding that it's so important that students and youth in general have learning and knowledge around climate change, right? But especially have learning and knowledge around climate justice. If our students are going to grow up to be adults who are impacted by these injustices, the least that we could do is to make sure that they have the skills that they need to survive and thrive. And that's not just learning about, here's climate change, here are all the impacts, right? But how do I organize with other students? How do I organize with folks in my community? How do I mobilize folks? How do I mobilize around policy and really make sure that change is going to happen? And so we've been working on a climate justice education task force that has really been working around principles of, all right, what are the things that students need to learn when we think about climate justice education, when we think about environmental justice education? Why is it important and who is it useful to? And what we are going to be doing in the next couple of weeks is building a coalition around this work of stakeholders across the state who also have a stake in this, who want to make sure that that legislation is passed around this, and that our students are prepared in whatever way that we can do that. If you are interested in that work, please send me an email. It's sort of in the coalition work, at least, is sort of in the earlier stages, but all are welcome to help us work on that work and engage our elected officials and other stakeholders who care about this as passionately as we do. And what I'm going to end with is that there are different forms of, yes.
Taylor, sorry to jump in. I'm just going to give like a 5-minute-ish warning and also encourage the attendees to use the chat so that we can tee up some questions for you. Thank you. Sorry.
Great. So I just wanted to end with the different forms of activism. So if you're thinking about getting involved, you've seen this presentation, you're like, all right, now what? Definitely take an opportunity to volunteer. There are a lot of ways that you can get involved via media and communication. There's a lot of social media movements going around, petitions and different ways to get engaged. And what we do as an organization, so if you're wanting to become a member, we get involved in the civil obedience pieces if we need to and when we have to, but do a lot of the direct lobbying, and a lot of that is testifying at hearings, getting involved in different working groups and other ways that you can engage the system and make change. If you want to be a member at WEACT, I highly recommend that you get involved. I'll send the link around. We're also doing an Earth Day 5K. We did a virtual 5K last year and it worked out great. I'll send the link around that if you're interested as well. It's on April 17th. And if you are interested in volunteering around our voter engagement work in public housing specifically, there's definitely a way to get involved if you email my colleague Grace. And then also email me as well. I try to answer my emails as best I can, but we'll be building the capacity in the department, and I'm always willing and wanting to connect with folks. So I can answer some questions here if there are any. So Jessica asks, do you have any educational resources for teachers available? I do. I'm putting together sort of a educational guide for teachers that'll come out at the beginning of March. So when that launches, I can definitely send it out. And I also have a recommended book list if anyone's wanting to read and know more about any of the topics. So I'll be sure to send that along to you, Jessica. You can absolutely get a copy of the PowerPoint. I can send it through you. Meredith, feel free to reuse parts or use it as a launching point for your own work. We
Taylor,
do have here.
There was another question about the environmental justice and leadership training. Just some like logistical questions about how long it lasts, is it done remotely, what's the commitment, etc.
Yeah, absolutely. We are launching some new cohorts of the EHJLT this spring. They will be digital for the first time. Usually it's in person. So there will be 3 or 4 classes per cohort, and the topics will change. So one night, we have 22 different topics. So one night you may, one cohort that you may sign up for may be food justice, energy efficiency, intro to climate justice, and environmental health. So the topics will change per cohort. So you'll just have to like search through when you sign up, whichever one you're most interested in. Yeah, the commitment is sort of up to you. If you can only make 2 out of the 3, that's okay. But there'll be about an hour to an hour and a half long of not only content, but engaging with other folks who are wanting to be leaders in this work. So I'll send that out when it comes out. And normally we only have 2 cohorts of EHJLT a year, but this spring we're going to offer a lot more, as well as a teacher-specific EHJLT offering. So there'll be a general training for like folks who are just wanting to learn more, and then a training specifically for teachers on a couple of different topics. Looking for the other questions.
Your organizations that work in Brooklyn and Queens.
Yeah, there are. Uprose definitely does a lot of work in Brooklyn. They do a lot of great work. So if you haven't like heard of them or worked with them before, I would definitely reach out to them. A lot of groups who work on environmental justice issues don't have like EJ in their name. Like Cooper Square is like a housing-based organization. They work on issues that are related to environmental justice. So they may work on lead and mold. They don't have EJ in their name, but if you're interested in that, I would definitely look them up. They're a little bit, they lean more housing-based. Yeah, Fifth Avenue Committee is also another group that works on environmental justice issues through the housing lens. In Queens, I'm sure there are some groups that we work with. We tend to work mostly in Northern Manhattan and in the Bronx as well, but I can send a couple of specific recommendations if you send me an email. I guess, so another part of this too is that like I work in a specific sphere, but my colleagues work in other spheres. So, you know, there may be other folks that we work with in Brooklyn and Queens that I can give you a more exhaustive list on where to look and who to work with.
That's excellent. We've got a good question here. All of these are great questions, but do you experience a lot of pushback when you try to ban certain products or pass EJ regulations? Has this resistance gotten better or worse in recent years?
That's a great question. I would definitely say like there's always, I would say there's some forms of pushback, and sometimes that's I would say we try to do a good jump on like explaining why we do the work that we do to sort of move past some of the pushback. I think and a lot of the work that we do with retailers specifically, right? Like there can be pushback on, I think we are doing enough, or we can only do this X, Y, and Z, which can sometimes make it difficult, but a lot of times that is improving. And I think that has been improving in part with this most recent like racial reckoning that we've sort of had, that folks are a little bit more open to having some of those discussions and seeing the connections to climate justice and environmental justice. And sometimes an opening is all it takes, even if folks have pushback, that they're willing to continue having conversations or like entertaining things for a while. Yeah, and then I think there are other folks who are, you know, not interested in working with us, or less interested in working with us. Yeah, so there's sometimes pushback, and folks are, for the most part, willing to be at the table and having a discussion.
Taylor, can you think of any, this might be tough too, can you think of anything that you would refer to as a model or a success, you know, specifically about policy inclusions for climate justice? Anything that you could like refer to and say, you know what, that's pretty good. We would like to try to do that here in New York State or New York City.
Yeah, I mean, I think there are a lot of, so for example, like thinking about legislation in New Jersey around climate change education is like a good model that we would want to use in New York State. And I think the difficulty with that is that sometimes the context is so nuanced that, you know, we're like, oh, like that's a good model, but it doesn't work for us. I think we look at a lot of really good models around like green jobs training in other states, that like if there's training around like what it means to work around like solar panels, and we want to improve our own programs, those are things that we sort of seek out and want to do. Yeah, I'm trying to think of like other like more specific examples. I mean, I think in the other opposite end of it, right, there are models for certain things that we want to look at as far as like having outcomes that we don't want. I think a really good example of this is, so there's a reform in public housing happening, and the similar reform around public housing has also happened in Minneapolis, which left a lot of residents displaced. And we are looking at that model to see whether or not that could happen to residents who live here. So sometimes that model works in the reverse. It's not something that we aspire to, but it's something that we're like, this happened in another place and we want to make sure that it doesn't happen here. So how do we prevent that from happening?
Yeah, that's a great point. Somebody asked about virtual class visits. Do you WEACT any capacity to do any virtual class visits? Great question.
Yeah, we do. So I do virtual class visits. I enjoy them because I used to be a teacher, and now I can go back and be a teacher for a day or for like a hot second. So normally it's just me, but we are building some capacity, and there will be another person who can come around and do some class visits. So most of that depends on email and my schedule. So if you are wanting to take the risk and give me enough time, normally it's like me, but my colleagues, if you're looking for something specific, are also equipped to do classroom visits. So if you're like, I teach a civics classroom, I teach in civics, and I want a policy person to come, it may not be me, it may be a colleague who might like want to come and engage.
And just also to, you know, Taylor's been very gracious with their offering for supporting some of the DOE efforts, including you all here today. So we're planning on trying to have Taylor back to host another workshop. I believe we had talked about in May, right? That's going to be, we're really going to specifically target students of any age. Of course, adults are also welcome, but just as a kind of an FYI to kind of stay tuned in that regard too, so that we can help cull together an audience for Taylor, and then have a similar situation in the near future. So awesome.
Absolutely.
Hey, Taylor, there's a question here that actually I'm kind of being selfish and asking because it ties into some other stuff we're doing together. But what is one skill you would consider young folks to consider in a journey to climate equity?
Definitely the community organizing skills, which are hard. They're hard to do because you have to build them. They're very experience based, right? But I think that there are a lot of really great, sometimes there are a lot of great ideas that folks have, but they don't get a lot of attention because no one has organized around it. Or there are climate injustices that that need to be brought to folks' attention through organizing, but we don't teach organizing in school necessarily, right? So that's something that you either learn outside of school or you learn with your community, right? Because there's someone who knows how to do it, knows how to strategize, knows how to make it happen. But at such a young age, I think with so much transition, like if you're planning on going to college or like leaving, right, or even staying there, those transitions can really throw you off from the momentum of the movement. So I think really having some consistency in how we teach young people how to organize can really help bolster some student-led movements.
Thanks. And Paula is the person that asked the question. And I think Paula, maybe in a high school, I can't remember what grade level she works in, but in a minute, we'll talk about our Youth Climate Summit that's coming up beginning next Tuesday. So if you're in high school, you could enroll 5 students to come to that with you, or anyone can come with their students to the weekly keynote series. There's 3 different weeks, and those are all 30-minute talks or less by students in the climate movement. So there could also be some more insights there too.
Absolutely. Yeah, and when Megan asked here about the sign up for EH, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, you go ahead, Megan. Sorry.
Megan asked about the sign up for EHJLT and if there are age and professional requirements. There will be some student EHJLT, some youth EHJLT sessions as well for like middle school and high school students. So if you are like middle school aged and above, there's room with you for the table. TBD on an elementary school based program.
Well, I think we're going to have to leave it there, Taylor. I can't thank you enough. I learned quite a bit myself, and I'm really grateful for your time today and the insights you brought to this work we all do together, and helping us understand a new perspective about it and its importance across a whole range of topics. So thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, and we know this is the first of a lot. So we'll be seeing you or someone, a colleague from yours at our Youth Climate Summit coming up later this month, and then again for another workshop in the spring on student focused on community organizing. So I'm going to close it out with a few slides. I'm going to share just about some upcoming opportunities if you're interested in continuing to join us for other things this month. We are really just cranking up full speed as an office this spring. If you have a seatbelt, you might want to put it on because we've got a lot going on. This next one is our next Meet the Experts series. Very excited to have Stephen O'Brien join us. He's with the Office of Food and Nutritional Services. So probably the second most popular question we get from our office, the first one's always about waste and recycling and trash. The second one I'd say is always about food. So Stephen's going to join us, talk to us about food policy and the DOE. A lot to unpack there. I know there's a lot of interest about what they're doing. We work with them a lot too because sustainability is obviously closely intertwined and connected to food. So join us next month, March 25th. Registration will be going up soon. That's via the Eventbrite you got today, but we'll be following up with you for links to register for that. Also, you've already heard me talk about it, but starting next Tuesday is the first week in our 4-week series of a Youth Climate Summit. We've done this now. This will be our 3rd year. Because we're going virtual, we're spreading it out over 4 weeks in March. So if you are a high school teacher today and you want to enroll your students, up to 5 students can join you for all 4 weeks of the Climate Summit beginning March 2nd. For anyone though, first time ever, for anyone, pay attention to this. We want you to join us every week to hear the youth keynotes. These are them. The 4th week, which is March 23rd, will be a career panel of 4 to 5 different people working in this field. So you can register on this link, bit.ly/NYCDOE-YCS21, and I'll get my colleagues Pat or Eliza to drop that in the chat box for you all. So really excited for that.
Yep, and if I could actually add one thing, Thad, if you are interested, if you're a high school educator and you are interested in signing up a cohort of students to come every week, the registration deadline closes today, actually. So anybody is welcome to come to the keynotes and sign up throughout March, but if you want to attend the full summit with a group of high school students, so you come to these keynotes, you come to climate action planning sessions and workshops, and actually Taylor is going to be doing a workshop as part of that. The registration deadline is today, and I believe my colleague Eliza just put the link in the chat.
Thank you, Pat. Yeah, so good distinguishing there. So Saved by the Bell is a school event, so sign up by today and you'll be in. And then big picture, looking ahead at other things in March, we are doing a series of trainings. This will be continuing the month. The theme for the month is climate education. So we're doing a student engagement series on March 5th. We did our first one last month. So on March 5th, there will be an opportunity. You can register with this link. 2 different sessions. One's for elementary school. The second one is for middle and high school students. Another opportunity, session 3 of 4 in our Green Team series will be in March, on March 10th. And then a special focus training where you can earn CTLE credits on March 18th to learn about climate education. It's a professional learning opportunity featuring DOE educators that are doing climate education work in the classrooms. So you highly recommend that, especially coming to learn from practitioners that are doing it themselves. You can't get any more relevant than that. So you can register for all of these events on our Eventbrite. And this is just the beginning. We have more in April and May, but I didn't want to totally overwhelm you all. So please take advantage of anything you can. And lastly, just thank you for joining us today. Again, we're really glad you're here. Want you to know that we will be following up within the next week with a recording to this. Taylor will also be forwarding their slides that will be sent out as well, so you can have that. And then, of course, you know where you can find us on Instagram. And, of course, you can email us anytime at sustainability@schools.nyc.org. So, again, thanks so much for spending the afternoon with us, and we look forward to seeing you at any of our events in March.